your talk, Dr. Zunes, where we have been as far as Palestine in the last 70 years, where we are now, and where we might be going, with a particular emphasis on what is happening with the in the Biden era. What are the signs so far of what Biden's policy might be towards Palestine, and most importantly, what do we as American citizens, and a lot of us are Arab American and South Asian American, and just American folks who are concerned and horrified by the policies of the Israeli Defense Forces in Gaza. In the last episode, just a few weeks ago, we saw the bombing, the death, and the destruction by one of the world's most sophisticated air forces and armies on life in an open air prison. These people have got literally rocks to defend themselves with, yet the US continues to arm the Israeli government, Israeli Defense Forces, to perpetrate these kind of horrors on unarmed civilians in Gaza. So please, with a focus on what our youth especially can do to bring about, to effectuate policy change in the halls, in the corridors of the US Congress. It is easy to fall into helplessness and the feeling that the powers against us are stacked so strongly and so high that there's nothing we can do. So if you can guide us in that area, hopefully our youth who have to carry this fight. I've got folks on this webinar right now that have been fighting this fight for Palestine for 3, 4, 5 decades now. And it's time for us to start handing the torch to the next generation. So what are some of your thoughts and ideas about how we can bring human rights, respect and dignity to the Palestinian people?
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate this opportunity to speak for you all. It's interesting that you talk about passing on to the next generation, because there is probably no single political issue in the United States today, with the possible exception of LGBTQ rights, where age and political attitude parallel as closely as on Israel and Palestine. This is quite a clear generational shift, and that the younger Americans are take a much more balanced view, or even a pro-Palestinian view, relative to their elders. And I am the father of young adults in their late 20s and early 30s, and I teach university students, and it's been quite remarkable. Especially with the events, the tragic events in Gaza a couple of months ago, the way that people have responded. That there's been a real shift, it seems. I mean, when I first started teaching Middle East politics way back in the 1980s, I had to really talk about Israel and Palestine. I had to really stress the Palestinian narrative because I assume most students were unaware of it. I mean, if anything, now I have to do it the other way around, just because there is a high level of as Black Lives Matter and others, and have brought a lot of young people of color to the forefront, and look at the issues in terms of racism and the like. But there's also, interestingly, there's probably no area where there's a bigger gap between rank and file public opinion and the politicians. That the Biden administration and Congress are well to the right of the American public. Again, probably more than any single issue out there. And I want to talk a little bit about describing, where the Biden administration and congressional leaders are, because the Democrats are in charge now, thankfully. But there's let's start with the 2020 Democratic platform. Biden's people, who dominated the platform writing committee, rejected calls by not just by pro-Palestinian groups, but even moderate pro-Israel groups like J Street to criticize the occupation by name. And instead, the Democratic platform not only didn't criticize the occupation, it didn't even mention it. And there's no criticism of the vast network of more than 250 illegal settlements Israel's established in the West Bank and other occupied territories in violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, a serious UN Security Council resolution, a landmark ruling by the International Court of Justice. The one thing that they did criticize was the BDS campaign. Efforts to boycott companies and other entities supporting the occupation and settlements. They rejected efforts by the Warren and Sanders delegates to support an Israel as a state for all its citizens. Instead, inserted language emphasizing U.S. support for Israel as a explicitly Jewish state. And the opposition to BDS is particularly striking, given that only 15% of Democrats even familiar with the issue oppose it. And 90% of Democrats believe the U.S. should either favor the Palestinians or take a neutral stance in the peace process, whereas the platform clearly says that we should support Israel. 81% of Democrats polled say they favor Israel's democracy more than its Jewishness. That is, they believe that should a two-state solution no longer be possible as a result of continued Israeli colonization of the West Bank, which many people support a single democratic state in which Arabs and Jews are equal, even if it meant Israel was no longer a politically Jewish state. 75% of Democrats believe U.S. military aid to Israel, like any other country, should be conditional on human rights and international law. Among young Democrats, it's closer to 90%. But the Democratic platform calls for spending up to $38 billion in unconditional aid in the coming years to Israel as ironclad. They say this is a commitment is ironclad, unconditional. In fact, during the primaries, when Warren and Sanders and Buttigieg called for conditioning aid to Israel, Biden called it bizarre and compared it to kicking France out of NATO. Biden is on record, and for most of his Senate career, Biden opposed the Palestinian state at all. But later in his career and subsequently as vice president, now as president, he says he does support a two-state solution. But interestingly, though he says he's for a two-state solution, he's pressing more countries to recognize Israel while actively discouraging countries from recognizing Palestine. In fact, the United States withdraw any funding from any agency of the United Nations which has Palestine as a member. He has repeatedly and quite appropriately condemned Palestinian attacks on Israeli civilians while he's defended Israeli attacks against Palestinian civilians. And in fact, when Secretary of State Blinken was asked about civilian casualties, Blinken just kept saying, "Oh, Israel has a right to self-defense." And when the reporter asked, "Do you believe Palestinians have a right to self-defense?" he demurred. Now, obviously, lobbing shells into civilian areas in Israel, that's not legitimate self-defense either. But even theoretically, the Secretary of State could not acknowledge that Palestinians have as much a right of self-defense as Israel does, or any other nation does. Now, the Biden administration insists that Israel should control at least 78% of Palestine, that is the pre-67 borders, but insists that Palestinian demands for the remaining 22% is too much, and they need to learn to compromise.
Oh.
Biden administration has no objections to the Israeli cabinet, including members who oppose Israel's right to exist. In fact, the new Prime Minister, Bennett, is quite explicit in his opposition to any Palestinian state and is pledged to fight it. Yet Biden says that we will cut off all relations with the Palestinian Authority if they have even one cabinet member that doesn't recognize Israel's right to exist. Biden has also launched a big campaign attacking the International Criminal Court for, among the more than 24 conflicts has investigated, that also investigate possible war crimes by Israel and Hamas and other parties. And the US says, no, it's okay to investigate Hamas, but you should not investigate Israel. And when Secretary of State Blinken was asked by Representative Ilhan Omar why the US opposed such an investigation, he insisted that Israel and the United States can hold themselves accountable for any war crimes. You don't need to go to the ICC. Well, the Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem have documented in detail that Israel has not held its soldiers, its generals, its people, accountable for war crimes. And so then in response, Ilhan Omar tweeted that all parties who have committed atrocities should be accountable, whether it be Israel or Hamas, whether it be US or the Taliban. And you remember how people reacted. She was attacked, not just by Republicans, but by the entire Democratic House leadership, saying that it foments prejudice and undermines progress towards peace and security for all. And another group of Democratic House members signed a letter insisting that that her statement was indicative of deep-seated prejudice, that she was giving cover to terrorist groups. Now, to Biden's credit, he's reversed a lot of policies of the Trump administration, including some foreign policy things. I mean, joining the Paris Climate Agreement, critically important. Trying to renew the Iran nuclear agreement. Cutting off at least some aid, military assistance to Saudi Arabia, recognizing the Armenian genocide, and all these things are good things. But he's not been that quick, and he's agreed to return humanitarian aid to the Palestinians. That's very good. But a number of key decisions, controversial decisions in the Trump administration, he's not reversing. For example, that the U.S. recognition of Jerusalem as solely Israel's capital. In fact, that was in the Democratic Party platform. And it says it should remain the capital of Israel, though making no mention that Palestinians want to share that multi-ethnic, multi-faith, and historically Palestinian city as their capital as well. And he hasn't, and he insists that we're keeping the U.S. embassy in Jerusalem. In fact, the bill passed back in 1998 that made it possible for the president to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem was co-sponsored by Senator Biden. Nor has Biden reversed Trump's recognition of the territory, nor has he reversed Trump's recognition of Israel's illegal annexation of the Golan Heights, which even Reagan and the Bushes refused to do. And I mean, think about that for a moment. I mean, how does the United States have any credibility opposing Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea, about which we've imposed sanctions on Russia, on the grounds that no country can expand its territory by force? I mean, that's very clear in the UN Charter. What credibility do we have to take that position while we have recognized Israel's annexation of the Golan, not to mention Morocco's annexation of Western Sahara, which is even worse, but that's another occupation. That's another issue. And of course, you have the double standards. Israel has nuclear weapons. Israel is in violation of UN Security Council Resolution 487, which calls on Israel to put its nuclear facilities under the trusteeship of the International Atomic Energy Agency. And yet we have these draconian sanctions and threatened war with Iran for simply having a nuclear program that isn't even a nuclear weapons program, at least at this point. We won't, in fact, the US officially, the Biden administration refused to even acknowledge that Israel has nuclear weapons. I mean, there are other issues to mention I want to go back a little bit to the final weeks of the Obama administration. There was a resolution that was by the UN Security Council that was reiterating 4 previous UN Security Council resolutions that reiterated the illegality of Israeli settlements and calling on the calling on Israel to stop, unlike the previous ones that called Israel to withdraw the settlements. This one simply said to freeze them, no, don't add to them. And all 14 of the 15 members of the Security Council voted for it. Obama abstained. However, Trump ended up attacking Obama for not vetoing it. And not only that, when the new Congress convened in early January 2019, a bipartisan resolution supported by a majority of Democrats sided with Trump against Obama, criticizing Obama for not vetoing the resolution. In fact, the congressional resolution basically said that the United Nations should butt out. The United Nations should not be involved in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That should only be between negotiations between the 2 parties, ignoring that one party is the occupation council resolutions, and of course, and the gross asymmetry of political asymmetry of power between the occupier and those under occupation. And by the way, a co-sponsor of that resolution was Senator Kamala Harris. It was her first foreign policy vote, first bill she co-sponsored, and she has bragged about it, saying she was proud of a first resolution. Now, basically, if you wanted to summarize, if people ask me to summarize the piece, and you need to
Sure. I'm not able to hear you anymore, Dr. Zunes.
I believe we lost him. His internet connection was too unstable. I think.
So now he's on.
All right, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we
Sorry
can.
about that.
Yeah,
Yes.
you're back.
Okay.
Thank you.
I was trying to explain the reason that there isn't really peace at this point is that the United States has a contradictory role of being the chief mediator in the conflict and the chief military, economic, and diplomatic supporter of one of the 2 parties. Now, anybody who's studied conflict resolution knows that there is a that if you're going to be a mediator, you have to be neutral. You have to, be even-handed. And so, not only is the United States as the sole mediator being so biased on one side, it is supporting the more powerful of the 2 sides. And the U.S. position is there can be no peace unless both sides mutually agree. And but you have the Prime Minister of Israel saying there's going to be no 2-state solution. We're not going to end the occupation. We're not going to, stop building these settlements. And so when the Palestinians, say tell the Palestinians, okay, no armed struggle, even though if you're under foreign belligerent occupation, legally you have that right. I mean, personally, I don't think that's the way to go, but legally the Palestinians do have the right to armed resistance. Not terrorism, but other. They say that you can't use the United Nations. You can't use other diplomatic routes for recognition. You can't support nonviolent civil society efforts like BDS. You just have to put all your trust in a peace process that is totally rigged against you, where the mediator is on the side of the occupying power the occupying power refuses to compromise, and the US refuses to pressure the occupying power to compromise by insisting military aid be unconditional, et cetera, and promises to veto any UN Security Council resolution that in any way would pressure Israel to compromise. So in other words, it's rigged from the beginning. Biden is not telling the truth when he says he supports a two-state solution, because there's no way there's going to be a two-state solution as long as Biden's policies continue to be our foreign policy. And I say Biden's policies, but essentially that basic thing of what I've outlined, that's been the same policy of Democratic and Republican administrations going back for decades. What about Congress? I mean, oftentimes we've seen when Democratic administrations have been a little hawkish or a little more conservative, that they can get pressure from the Democrats, at least when the Democrats have the majority. Well, a few months ago, Congresswoman Belly McCollum from Minnesota introduced a bill that would prohibit U.S. provided armed security assistance to Israel from being used in certain violations of international humanitarian law, such as military detention and abuse of children, demolition of homes, illegal confiscation of Palestinian property, annexation of occupied land. And in response to, it only got a couple dozen co-sponsors, but in response to that response to that bill, 125 House members, a clear majority of Democrats in the House, joined virtually every Republican in signing a letter insisting that aid to Israel remain unconditional, saying that adding conditions such as those would somehow be detrimental to Israel's ability to defend itself, which would appear to indicate that they believe that these kind of illegal activities constitute legitimate self-defense. And of course, it's also a rebuke of Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, a wide variety of other peace and human rights groups that have called for making military aid to Israel contingent on an end to its ongoing flagrant violations of international humanitarian law. Conditions which these groups advocate for other nations as well, like Saudi Arabia, which has killed even more civilians than Israel has. Consensus among Middle Eastern scholars, and by broad I mean comparable to climate scientists and climate change. I mean, 90+% of Middle East scholars have argued that unconditional U.S. military, economic, and diplomatic support for Israel has made that government more intransigent regarding the occupation of Palestinian territory, its ongoing human rights abuses, its belligerent policies towards Iran. And despite this, in language that can only be described as Orwellian, this letter insists that, quote, security aid to Israel is a specific investment in the peace and prosperity of the entire Middle East. And it also makes the bizarre claim that it, quote, makes the region a safer place and bolsters diplomatic efforts aimed at achieving a negotiated two-state solution resulting in peace and prosperity for both Israelis and Palestinians. The reality is that since the collapse of the peace initiative led by Secretary of State John Kerry back in 2014, there's been no peace talks. And the Israelis, who are primarily responsible for the failure due to Netanyahu and now Bennett's refusal to end the Israeli colonization of the West Bank or withdraw from much of the occupied territory, allow for the creation of a viable Palestinian state, even when the Palestinians offered strict enforceable security guarantees and virtually every condition put forward by the Obama administration. But given the insistence of Obama, Trump, and now Biden to keep the aid flowing regardless, the Israelis know they can get away with this hardline position with the knowledge that there would be no tangible pressure for them to compromise. And in the House, this congressional letter implied that any reduction in aid on human rights grounds somehow would open Israel to attack. So even portraying Israel as a passive victim of Iranian aggression, without mention of Israel's attacks against Iran's nuclear program, its shipping, its forces in Syria, et cetera. In fact, the conditioning aid would not be abandoning Israel. I mean, if Israeli leaders believe the country's continued violations of international humanitarian law in the occupied territory are more important than receiving US assistance, that's their choice. In any case, Israel doesn't need US aid for its defense needs. Israel is already by far the most powerful country, a nation in the Middle East against any combination of possible enemies. It has a substantial arms industry of its own. In fact, they're a major arms exporter. In fact, it's the only country in the region with a nuclear deterrent. I mean, I did an interview several years ago with the late Israeli Major General and former Knesset member Mati Peled, and he acknowledged that US aid to Israel is more about the profits of American arms manufacturers than meeting Israel's defense needs, and included weaponry that had little practical purposes for Israel based on their own strategic assessments. But he noticed how this unconditional aid emboldened Israeli hardliners, and it also indicated costing Israeli taxpayers billions of dollars of additional money in personnel training and spare parts. The House letter, however, insists this aid is cost effective. Again, 80% of US aid to Israel doesn't go to Israelis, it goes to American arms manufacturers. And of course, the broad consensus of Middle East scholars, we recognize that the problem is not that there are not enough weapons in the Middle East. There are far too many weapons in the Middle East. And yet Congress and the Biden administration insisting somehow there's not enough arms and we need to send even more at taxpayer expense. This letter, they appear intent on fueling a regional arms race, which, while quite profitable for American arms manufacturers, actually threatens the peace and security of the region. Indeed, the letter praises support for security partners like Egypt. The Egyptians are suffering under this brutally oppressive military rule of General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Now, why is all this? Let me talk a little. I could go on and on about just how biased U.S. policy is, but let me talk about the explanation, because we're going to challenge. We need to understand why. And I want to start off. The official line is we're defending Israel. Basically this progressive democracy against these Arab hordes or whatever. But that's nonsense. On the grounds, first of all, in Israel's first 20 years of existence, when it was most vulnerable strategically and its democratic institutions strongest, the US gave virtually no military aid to Israel. 99% of all US aid to Israel came after 1967, when Israel found itself more powerful than any combination of Arab armies and became the occupier of millions of Palestinians. In fact, the more repressive Israel has become, the more right-wing it's become, and the stronger it's become relative to its neighbors, the more the US aid. So it's going in just the opposite direction of the official explanation of why we provide aid to Israel. And it's not about the so-called Jewish vote. American Jews are actually a smaller percentage of the US population than they were earlier in US history, when the US was providing less aid. And more important, on the question of Israel, especially young Jews. The majority of young Jews are opposed to the occupation, and a sizable number are not Zionists at all. Indeed, some of the most hardline pro-Israel members of Congress are from districts and states with very, very small Jewish populations. And if you look at the three presidents that shifted US aid or US support for Israel most dramatically, who escalated US aid most dramatically compared to their predecessors, it was Richard Nixon, George W. Bush, and Donald Trump, who got the smallest percentage of Jewish votes of any modern presidents. So it's not about the Jewish vote. And here I'm going to step out on a limb, because this is going to surprise a lot of people. It's not AIPAC or the so-called pro-Israel lobby. And I want to explain that. the first of all, the lobbies can be influential in terms of Congress, and AIPAC definitely has an influence in Congress. That's why you get these, so many otherwise progressive Democrats signing these ridiculous letters like the one I quoted. But the overall, but foreign policy is generally made by the president. Unless there's a huge grassroots movement like the anti-Vietnam War movement or something, foreign policy is hard. The president really has a lot of power here. And every time a president has faced down AIPAC, they've won. Eisenhower in the Suez Crisis. Kennedy with the water controversy, with Syria and Jordan. Jimmy Carter with the first Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Reagan and the AWAC sale to Saudi Arabia. George H.W. Bush and the loan guarantees. Obama, with the Iran nuclear agreement and a number of issues as well. And let's also remember that for 25 years, the United States supported Indonesia's occupation of East Timor. With Indonesians wiped out 1/3 of that island nation's population. There was no Indonesian American lobby that forced us to do that. And today in Western Sahara, US, we don't even pretend to support a two-state solution. The US recognizes, the only country in the world actually, that legally recognizes Morocco's annexation of Western Sahara. Back in 1975, against the UN Security Council resolutions, landmark World Court decision, et cetera, et cetera. It was not a Moroccan-American lobby that forced us to do that. The unfortunate reality is that the United States is perfectly capable of supporting right-wing governments run roughshod over fundamental international legal norms without an ethnic lobby forcing our hand to do so. So I want to talk about the three main reasons I see the US has the policy it does. I'll save the most important one for last. But one of the reasons, and those of you in Texas are well aware of this, is the Christian right, who believe that modern Israel is the manifestation of biblical scripture, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is simply the continuation of the conflict between the Israelites and the Philistines. We all know whose side God was on in that one. In the words of Senator James Inhofe of neighboring Oklahoma, we shouldn't even have a peace process because it was decided in the 15th chapter of Genesis. It's the word of God. You shouldn't argue with the word of God. And the Christian right, and again, those of you in Texas know this is approval, well, pretty much control the Republican Party at this point. And and so that that is there are 40 million evangelical Christians, large numbers of which believe in this dispensationalist theology, that Israel is necessary for the second coming of Christ. Of course, all the Jews will go to hell when that happens, but they want the Jews for Act 1, not Act 2. They essentially control the Republican Party, so that's half of Congress, right there. And on the Democratic side, and it looks like I see enough gray hairs to say there are people here that remember this, was that kind of liberal idealism about Israel. Think Paul Newman in Exodus. Think of those plucky kibbutzniks and the wonderful democratic socialist experiments of the kibbutz movement, and the labor Zionism, and even my non-Jewish friends would go and work on a kibbutz for a time. There's this kind of idealistic view about Israel, guilt around the Holocaust. My God, they survived a genocide, give them a break. This kind of fear that if we criticize Israel, even if justified, it could encourage anti-Semitism. Think about it. If there's only one black state in the world, like Israel's doing, you can imagine that not only a lot of African Americans, but a lot of white liberals and progressives as well might be a little defensive when you hear the criticism. I mean, even me, if I walk into a room and there are two people I don't know, and they're going on and on and on about all the terrible things Israel's doing, even if I agree with every single thing they're saying, there's a part of me that thinks, why are they saying that really? Because they are concerned about human rights, international law everywhere? Or are they using it as an excuse to go after the world's only Jewish state? And I think that's those of us who work on Palestine, we need to be aware of this. Now, that should not make us at all shy about challenging Israeli policy, speaking out against it, and particularly what the United States is doing to make it possible. But we need to understand that perception, especially from that older generation of liberals who tend to dominate the Democratic Party. You know, so it's in many ways comparable to a lot of leftists who, who deny atrocities by various left-wing third world governments because, oh, if you criticize them, you're attacking socialism, you're supporting U.S. imperialism, so we're gonna, defend, these various dictators who call themselves socialists and deny human rights abuses are taking place. I mean, we've all run into people like that. I mean, there's a similar kind of phenomenon that happens about liberals, with Israel. I mean, in hindsight, I was a little starry-eyed and idealistic about the Sandinistas back in the 80s. I mean, it's something that it's a phenomenon that exists, and we need to be aware of that. So those are the first two reasons. But the main reason, I would argue, for U.S. support for Israel is strategic. The same reason we support in any other ally. Israel is, in the words of one former Secretary of State, our unsinkable aircraft carrier. In the Middle East, a strategic region of the world, our Arab allies could be overthrown in a coup or revolution anytime, but Israel's going to still be there. Israel's going to support us, and they have this high technology industry. I mean, seriously, the military industrial complexes the two countries are closely intertwined in development of new jet fighters, anti-missile technologies, et cetera, et cetera. Israel's funneled arms to third parties, pro-Western governments, pro-Western insurgencies, including third parties U.S. couldn't support directly for political reasons. Remember the Iran-Contra scandal? The Contras, it was Israel. Similarly, Israel supporting the Guatemalan junta during the genocidal wars against the indigenous population there, when it was even too much for even Reagan to support. Apartheid South Africa. Israel was our go-between and backing apartheid when it was illegal for the U.S. to support that. In fact, Israel even clandestinely supported armed Iran, during the as part of Iran-Contra. More recently, various Kurdish groups, Colombian paramilitaries. Israel has been used as a go-between. Similarly, the Mossad and the CIA collaborate in intelligence gathering and covert operations. I mean, I could go down the list. I mean, there are, one can make the argument that strategically it actually hurts us in the long run because it's alienating, billion-plus Muslims around the world and everything else. But by certain measures, there is a strategic logic to this close relationship. And can imagine Israel at peace with its neighbors, where you have Israeli technology, Palestinian entrepreneurship and industriousness, Arabian oil wealth blended together. It would be great for the Middle East. What would it mean to American arms manufacturers, oil interests, strategic planners? I don't want to sound conspiratorial about this, but there is a bit of divide and rule going on, because all these arms we send to Israel, the Arab states can pay in petrodollars to balance it, and we keep, all the way. I mean, Israel's of course suppressed leftist movements, not just among the Palestinians, but in Jordan and Lebanon as well. More recently, suppressed Islamist movements. I mean, there's a lot and stuff with Iran. I mean, you go down the go down the list. I mean, one Israeli analyst around the time of the Iran-Contra scandal said that Israel's become just like another federal agency when it's convenient to use when you want something done quietly. And what's also kind of interesting about this is if you look at the history of anti-Semitism, like in medieval Europe, where how the ruling class would kind of make a tacit agreement with the Jewish community, saying we'll give you a degree of political and cultural autonomy if you do the dirty work for us. Be the money lenders, the tax collectors, kind of the visible agents of the oppressors. And when the people would rise up against the oppression, the ruling class would say, "Oh, it's not us, it's the Jews," and you'd have the pogroms and the ways of anti-Semitism. Jews would scatter into another country, and the cycle would start again. And it went for centuries, culminating, of course, in the Holocaust. And the idea of Zionism, what if Jews, paradoxically, initially with the British and French, when they wanted to get rid of Nasser and the Suez Crisis in '56, and in more recent years, in some of the ways I've described and more, it's the same kind of thing. So you have these reactionary Arab regimes blaming Zionism for their problems, and sort of cover up their own close relationship with U.S. imperialist interests. And I even talked to like a half dozen Arab foreign ministers and deputy foreign ministers when I asked them, why are you still so tolerant of the US given all the things we're doing to the Palestinians? Every one of them answered along the lines of, oh, your ambassador or your State Department guy explained to us the Jews really control US foreign policy and you can't help it. In other words, they're using the classic anti-Semitic scapegoating, to cover up, for what's really happening. I could go on, but I think maybe I'll stop here and open up things for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Zunes. Thank you very much for a very enlightening, informative discussion. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and your insights with us about an issue that we all care about. We've been talking about and working and taking action and lobbying and writing letters to the editor and been on the streets. Some of the folks on this in this discussion for decades now. So it's refreshing to hear your ideas. May I ask a question, please? Could you comment on the recent change in sort of the political architecture of the Middle East with the so-called peace deal between Israel and UAE and Bahrain? And also, would you comment on the role, particularly of Saudi Arabia? I mean, where is, in your opinion, Saudi Arabia with the Palestinian issue? And if you could comment on Egypt and Turkey, and of course, Iran, that would be wonderful too.
Well, I mean, I think the peace deals with Bahrain and UAE. They both the countries total what, maybe 3 million people total, and they've never been at war with Israel. So why is it even called a peace deal? And they're dictatorial regimes that suppress any opposition to the recognition. So that's grossly. That their significance is grossly overstated. In terms of Sudan, it was downright extortion. Here's this country has this amazing nonviolent pro-democracy revolution, overthrew one of the most brutal genocidal regimes in the world. And they're still stuck with draconian sanctions that the US imposes, but like the Iranian sanction impacts all anti-COVID stuff. I mean, it really, and basically they were forced to normalize relationship with Israel in order to being taken off the list of state sponsors of terrorism, even though, obviously since the overthrow of the dictatorship, there had not been any terrorism coming out of Sudan. And in terms of Morocco's recognition, that was in return for US recognition of their illegal annexation of Western Sahara. So these are, so each, and I also mentioned Bahrain, UAE, their motivation was this new arms deal. So in other words, these were all transactional. And it's not like the Arab world has suddenly said, oh, Israel's cool, we can We don't mind what they're doing to the Palestinians, that kind of thing. Now the Saudi Arabia, for various reasons, can't go as far as recognizing that, but Saudi Arabia and Israel and the United States all share certain things in common. That is strident opposition of Iran asserting itself as a regional power. And I'm a big critic of the Iranian regime, but the fact is that they've been a regional power on and off the past 2,500 years. That's not going to. And we're going to have to learn to deal with it, other than just being belligerent. They are, they're opposed to any kind of leftist or even significantly liberal democratic movements in the region, and all three, of course, are opposed to certain kinds of Islamist movements. Even though Saudi Arabia is about the most rigid, repressive, reactionary Islamist regime in the world, but they're, as long as they're allied with the U.S. strategically, it's okay. But the point being is that that Saudi Arabia is not going to really put pressure on the United States or anything decent on Palestine. I mean, we all know, going back for decades, Arab leaders have made lip service to the Palestinian cause and left them to suffer. Turkey, prior to the Erdogan, coming to power, actually had pretty close relations with Israel. And despite the flotilla incident and a few things like that, they are, they're still, actually fairly close relations. That's been going on for some time. But even though I'm trained in international relations, these kind of diplomatic moves, as I am in what's happening on the ground, because no matter how many deals Israel makes with other countries facilitated by the United States or anybody else, the fact is that it's impossible for them to continue to occupy 5 million Palestinians. And it just cannot be done. And one thing that the Arab Spring showed us, even though Tunisia is the only really success story out of that, but Sudan, phase 2. I mean, that's pretty exciting what's happened there. But the fact is that the future of the Middle East is not what happens in Washington or London or even among the halls of government. It's what the people decide ultimately. And we've seen how even authoritarian regimes have been brought down by the power of massive nonviolent action, massive non-cooperation. And the Palestinians and their struggle is not going to go away. And we're seeing international solidarity growing. I mean, so in other words, in certain ways, talking about sort of the diplomatic stuff and the various nations around Israel and Palestine is like, what does the US government, the British government, and the governments of Botswana, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique have to do, and or use Lesotho and Swaziland as kind of the equivalent of the UAE and Bahrain. What does that mean in terms of ending apartheid? It's really secondary to what happens on the ground. And the question is the United States going to keep trying to press the lid on a boiling pot? Because this current system is not going to last. And is the United States going to be on the right side of history or not? And given these changes I mentioned demographically in the U.S. and political attitudes, yeah, U.S. policy is going to change. We are going to become more even-handed. We are going to eventually, support equal rights for Palestinians, whether it be in a two-state solution or a single binational state with equal rights. But how many people are going to die in the meantime?
Before we open this to questions from our participants, let me thank our tech guru, Mr. Nick Hernandez. Nick, thank you very much for helping us again today. If you have questions, just please unmute yourself and Dr. Zunes, your question.
Yes, I have a comment, Brother Hadi. First, this is Murjan Abu Mahmoud. I would like to thank Dr. Stephen Zunes for his very informative, great lecture, actually. And I would like to thank you, Brother Hadi. I think that Israel will continue to be a colonial settler, apartheid occupation, and as long as it's treated above the law with impunity and no accountability. Actually, they are killing the two-state solution and with built-in settlements, with de facto annexation. Biden said when he ran for president during his campaign, he stated that human rights will be at the core of the very idea of America. And the United States is safer when the fundamental rights are protected everywhere, worldwide. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem that he is applying this to the Palestinians.
Or any Arab peoples, actually, because he's supporting Arab dictatorships as well. It's not just.
Yeah, unfortunately. Yes, actually, during the platform, this is something that he interfered to make sure that there is no statement about the end of occupation, about ending occupation to be, put in the platform of the Democratic Party. Also, he interfered against putting any conditions on the financial aid to help
I
Israel.
talked about that. Let's start my lecture.
What do you think? Like the Senate yesterday, they approved, the appropriation committee approved the money without condition to Israel. How we are as like Palestinian Americans, as Muslim Americans, as progressives Americans, how can we help to change this and pressure this administration? Thank you.
Great question. Before I answer that, I just want to mention that in the chat, I gave my email address, which is you can write if you want to be on my email list. Roughly once a month or so, I send out my latest articles. These are sometimes they're academic articles, and most of the time they're fairly short, kind of op-ed or policy briefs, that kind of thing. So email me and just say, please put me on your email list. I'll do that. I also have a website. I put the address there, stephenzunes.org, and at it hasn't quite, the homepage hasn't been updated yet, but if you look into articles, you see more recent articles, and there's one on Israel Palestine as well as a number of other issues, and you're welcome to check that out as well. In terms of question about how we get that, how we get from here to there. Remember, I've been around long enough to remember the protests against the Vietnam War, and those against the nuclear arms race, and those against U.S. intervention in Central America, and in terms of our quiet support for apartheid South Africa. Even less well-known issues like U.S. support for the Indonesian occupation of East Timor. We probably still, Iraq would have even been worse if there hadn't been the kind of opposition, that came out there, and that we have, we have certain rights here in this country that unfortunately most people, including Palestinians, most people in the Middle East, including Palestinians, don't have, and that is right to express ourselves politically without fear of direct persecution. Yes, there's certainly McCarthyistic attacks against people like me and others who are visible on this, but nothing as bad as what the Palestinians and others face, and so we should take advantage of that. And I think the thing is, unlike a lot of issues I've been involved with, majority of Americans are already on our side. Majority of Americans believe the United States should put pressure on Israel to compromise. Majority of Americans, believe that aid to Israel should not be unconditional. Majority of Americans, believe that Israel should stop the settlement, should stop the persecution of the Palestinian people. We already have majority of people on our side. It's a matter of mobilizing. My personal view is I think it's probably not a good idea to focus on Zionism per se. I mean, I certainly don't consider myself a Zionist. I believe that to whatever extent there were emancipatory and liberating aspects of Zionism for Jews as an oppressed people, do not compensate for the colonial settler aspects of Zionism and the racism and things like that. But that it is important to remember that there are Zionists like J Street, for example, who oppose the occupation, and who are ultimately who are potential allies, at least on some issues. And that there is and there's a lot of definitions of Zionism, and this should be there shouldn't be, and I think we should avoid ideological fights. In other words, let's focus on where people agree, and the vast majority of people agree the United States should not be supporting governments that bomb entire apartment blocks, that demolish people's homes to bring in colonists. That should not, that the people should not be discriminated against because of their religion and ethnicity. And that the United States should not be supporting that kind of thing. And so I think if we just really, again, try to avoid the ideological fights, and personally, I think it's probably too late for a two-state solution. I mean, think just the demographics in terms of the colonization of the West Bank, and I'm not very fond of an ethnically identified state of any kind. But I don't tend to emphasize in the argument. I still emphasize, I still push the anti-occupation angle, because I think strategically it's easier for people to understand and digest, instead of the calling for the dissolution of Israel as we know it. I think on legally, in terms of international law, where it's in the with that we have there is an important distinction between Israel proper and the occupied territories. So I would so these are some of the things I would suggest in terms of being more effective in our organizing. And again, that doesn't mean that we should declare ourselves Zionists or say that the two-state solution is the only way or anything like that. But I'm just saying that I think emphasizing areas where we have a majority of support already, is a good way forward in terms of changing policies.
I guess I'll ask a question then.
Mm-hmm.
This Imad Salim from Fort Worth, Texas.
Mm-hmm.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, mm-hmm. Sound good.
Okay, thank you. The first thing is thank you, Doctor, for this excellent presentation. Thank you for the folks who put this event together. It is very important that we keep the Palestinian issue alive, especially now that the war has ended, the attack has ended on Gaza, and it seems like normally after this happened, people just go back to work and to normal, not like nothing has happened. But the Palestinians, especially in Gaza, are still suffering in an open air prison, and we have to keep on talking about their situation until the suffering ends and until the Israeli occupation ends of Palestine and the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem. The question I have for the doctor is, you mentioned the evangelical Christians, and it seems like this will be the last group of Americans that will stop supporting Israel in the whole country, if they stop supporting Israel. Even if the and they already moved on and they support ending the Israeli occupation of Palestine. But this evangelical Christian groups and the Christian Zionists, from what I read or from what I heard, they give more financial support to Israel than Jewish Zionists even.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's a huge group, and they have a lot a lot of clout financially and in the government also, especially when it's a Republican administration.
Yeah.
The question I have for the professor is, how do we convince these people that they ought to be on the human rights issue rather than on their religious belief issues?
I mean, I think there's certain people that are attached to certain forms of hardline theology, and this is true with Jews and Muslims as well. That unfortunately, logical arguments, don't work directly. But I do. But what is exciting is that there are a lot of Christian groups that are based in the Gospels and their strong commitment to social justice. The Catholic Church and the mainline Protestant denominations, where they have taken positions in Israel-Palestine, have in fact been quite progressive. You have major congregations like the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists, which have voted to divest their shareholdings in corporations that are supporting the Israeli occupation. You have there's some of the traditional peace churches like the Quakers have often been in the forefront on this issue. Going back for many decades. And there's groups like Sabeel, which is led by Christian Palestinians, but have a support group called Friends of Sabeel here in the United States that is appealing to Christians to support the Palestinian cause, and even some of the handful of progressive evangelical groups like Sojourners. Not all evangelicals are right wing. Have done some really good work, work on this. But I think if you the interesting thing that evangelicals will be quick to cite Genesis 15 or whatever, and supporting the occupation, but think about the message of the Gospels is much more inclusive thing. It is not about one people having rights over the others. I mean, there's a parable of the Good Samaritan. Draw on in the Christian tradition, to appeal to the fundamental basic sense of justice.
Hello, I'm Aftab Siddiqui, and I thank you very much, Professor, for a very eye-opening presentation here. We have been working on this issue for decades, but your perspective has really added some new angles to the issue. So my question to you, as we all we support the BDS movement, and we really write to the newspapers and lobby with our Congress elected delegation. But still, we see that some of the Democratic representatives, House representatives, they, when contacted by AIPAC, they tend to give them more weightage in their voting pattern in the Congress than the others. So how do you think that we can make it more effective, the cause of justice in Palestine?
I think one thing would be to get the progressive groups to make Israel-Palestine one of the issues on which they decide to endorse or send money to. Because for example, Progressive Democrats of America, they're a fairly major group. Move On, I'm sure most of you are familiar with. But even peace groups like Peace Action, which grew out of the Nuclear Freeze campaign and sane nuclear policy, the oldest peace group in the country. All three of those organizations have endorsed Democrats that have taken really right-wing positions, including signing that letter, that I mentioned. And when I've asked them about, I used to be on the board of Peace Action, actually. When I've asked these folks, he said, well, almost, the vast majority of people, of members, Congress say AIPAC is really powerful. We can, can't really count it, but that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Of course, you're going to side with AIPAC if you know you're going to get support of the progressive groups anyway. For taking the AIPAC position. I mean, if you had to look both ways instead of just one way. Now, I'm not pretending for a moment that, Peace Action is as powerful as AIPAC. But given that the propensity of these Democrats are probably more to the left anyway, that if their core constituents start saying, okay, we'll vote for you against a Republican, but we're not going to give you any money, or we're not going to formally endorse you, that would make them think twice. So, we're not going to, we can't change the administration's policy unless we change Congress. And we can't change Congress unless we change the Democrats. We're not going to change the Democrats as long as they think they can take the AIPAC line and get away with it. And so I'd say if you're a member of Progressive Democrats of America, or a member of Move On, or Peace Action, or any of these groups, let them know that you expect them to make their position Israel-Palestine, along with other issues, and not the main issue, but along with others, as a criteria for endorsement and for financial contributions. Because I remember, back in, take Peace Action back in the 1980s, it was then called Sane Freeze. Even if a member of Congress supported, say, the nuclear freeze or certain nuclear issues, if they support unconditional aid to the Salvadoran junta, the Nicaraguan Contras, they weren't going to get Peace Action's endorsement. Well, why are the lives of Palestinian civilians less important than those of Salvadoran and Nicaraguan civilians? Why? In other words, we need, in many ways, it's not the power of AIPAC as much as the weakness of the Democratic left, or the weakness of the peace movement. And that we need to stop, say that let's, okay, again, we don't, there are a lot of important peace issues out there. You don't have to make Israel-Palestine the number one issue, but don't ignore it either. Don't pretend it's not there. And seriously, if there's a member of Congress who says categorically that sending unconditional military aid to a right-wing government that commits war crimes, running roughshod of the UN Charter, somehow promotes peace and prosperity for all, the implications of that go well beyond Israel-Palestine. And that says a lot about them in a bigger sense as well. And it tells me that they don't deserve the endorsement of a group that calls itself progressive, much less a peace group.
That's really good, Dr. Zunes. Those kind of politicians need to be called out, and need to be called out boisterously by progressives and activists that are on the screen. Any more questions for Dr. Zunes? We've got about maybe 10 more minutes. If you have any questions, please do that, or just chime in with your comments. What is your takeaway from listening to Dr. Zunes today, and how can we change our strategy? What can we learn from this discussion?
Yes, I had a question. This is Deli Ikambo. I wanted to ask, you cited numbers or statistics that, the vast majority of people, or a large percentage of Democrats, support the Palestinian cause, certain aspects of it. So why is it that it seems to me, at least, and maybe to other people, that people are very silent? They don't really comment. I'm just taking like social media as an example. People don't say much. So I'm just wondering what you think, why people are now open about it, even though they support it.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of reasons. One, as I mentioned, that kind of a lot of liberals are kind of nervous about talking about this issue for reasons I mentioned earlier, especially older liberals. I think that especially given the climate you find on social media, you know that if you say anything about Israel Palestine, it's going to get things can get crazy, and a lot of people just try to avoid conflict on social media. A lot of people, take this kind of thing. Oh, it's complicated, which is kind of an excuse for not, which really frustrates me because obviously there are unique aspects to this conflict, and I've addressed some of them, but there's some things that are pretty clear cut that are clearly wrong that should be addressed. But I think I think among younger people, it is becoming a much more visible issue, a much more talked about issue in terms of my students and my kids, social media, it ranks up there with other issues that are contentious issues that I think people are willing to willing to talk about. And and in general, foreign policy does not get as much attention as I think it should, in part because we have so many pressing issues at home with inequality, with the environment, with immigrants' rights, with Black lives. There's so much happening here that, in fact, one of the courses I teach regularly is U.S. foreign policy, and it used to max out every year. Now, because people are just not as much into foreign policy as well. But I think it's not quite as bleak as you imply. I think they're very I think we're starting to see movement, especially among younger people. There's a comment about Israel obviously have a tendency to destroy those of us who are vocal against them. Obviously there's going to be character assassination and things like that. But I remember being called a communist constantly for my criticism of U.S. policy in Central America and Vietnam and that kind of thing. There's going to be name calling. I've had speeches canceled. I've had, saying, okay, you're allowed to speak, but you got to be followed by a pro-Israel, as in pro-occupation speaker. These things, I've been called all sorts of names, and I'm on the Canary, whatever it is, website. I know that there's this kind of stuff, but I've been getting all sorts of trolling. My latest book is in Western Sahara, and I'm getting trolled by these Moroccans saying I'm a paid Algerian agent. And they've been doing the same kind of pressure. When Jose Ramos Horta, the East Timorese de facto foreign minister, when he won the Nobel Peace Prize, there's pressure to campuses to cancel his talks. Occupying powers can get defensive, not just Israel, Morocco, and Indonesia as well. And so it's out there. And in terms of the politicians, it's not as bad as one thinks. I remember the one I remember off the top of my head. There are more recent examples too, but in Israel invaded Lebanon in 2006, huge bipartisan majority supported this awful resolution defending what Israel did and denying they were responsible for the massive civilian casualties. It was just a horrific resolution. And there are only about 24 members of Congress, of the House, that opposed it. But they're all Democrats except for Ron Paul. But every single Democrat that either voted against or abstained that resolution got reelected that November by a larger majority than they had 2 years earlier. This idea that it'll destroy your political career, unless you're in maybe metropolitan New York or South Florida, it's really not going to, it's not really going to hurt your career that much. It really is. And the examples people give, like Paul Finley or Cynthia McKinney or whatever, I've looked into those issues, and there are a bunch of other things that were happening that election cycle as well. It was not the issue that led to their defeat. It was one among many. I'm not saying it's a paper tiger. I mean, I'm not denying, you know, that there's influence. Again, I've mentioned examples of where it's impacted me, but it's not as powerful or monolithic or whatever. I think it's I mean, I think that there's a lot people want you to think that. A lot of people want you to think that. The lobby wants you to think that. They exaggerate their power because it serves them. Politicians want you to think that because, again, oh, I can't help it. The lobby is forcing me to do this. I need the contributions. I need And anti-Semites want you to think that because they like that it feeds their narrative as all-powerful cabal of Jews behind the scenes running things. You know, so there are all sorts of people who want to exaggerate the power of the Israel lobby. So again, this is not to say that it isn't a factor, but let's just be careful not to overstate it, because frankly, if you do, again, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Why bother? Why should we even try? Why shouldn't we go and endorse these guys anyway? You know, et cetera.
All right, last question, guys.
A comment just to follow up on this issue with the strength of the Israeli lobby. At the moment, there's a battle being played out in Ohio, the 11th congressional district, where Nina Turner is running to represent Ohio, because the previous congresswoman became the housing secretary, and Nina Turner, of course, being a progressive, she had, I mean, she has like 6 or 7 opponents in this race, which is coming up, will be on the ballot on August 8th. And seems like the Democratic establishment and the Israeli lobby both are supporting Nina Turner's opponents.
Yeah.
For one major reason, because she's a progressive. And she was the co-chair of course, Senator Bernie Sanders last year. And that's probably the major reason that they're against her. And that's why they put in millions of dollars in the coffins of her opponent. And of course, she supports the Palestinian issue, and she spoke multiple times about that. And that's one other reason why the Israeli lobby will be putting all
that reinforces what I said about those other issues as well. Yes, Palestine is one issue, but there are a lot of others. And the and again, I think Nina Turner's going to win, and a lot of people, including Sanders and Warren and actually and some key unions, a lot of folks are backing behind her. But again, it's a classic thing between the progressive and more mainstream parts of the Democratic Party, and Israel is one issue on this. But I don't think it's going to be the deciding issue. But what's exciting, one thing that really has shifted and gives me hope, is that it is becoming a more clear progressive issue. That it is one of those things that defines the progressive wing and the establishment wing of the Democratic Party. It used to be a little more mixed up than that. And I think the more it's defined as a progressive issue, and consistent with progressive values, which oppose unconditional military aid to Arab dictators as well. That supports demilitarization and human rights everywhere. As long as it's within that context, and that's why I think we should be really careful to avoid kind of this Israel exceptionalism. Again, see it as part of a broader struggle. Instead of saying to a mainstream Democrat, your problem is that you're too pro-Israel. The problem is saying, your problem is you're supporting a right-wing government engaging in gross and systematic human rights violation in violation of fundamental principles of international law. That people can listen to and not get so defensive. Oh, what's wrong with supporting Israel? Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Dr. Zunes. On behalf of North Texas Peace Advocates, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. And thank you everybody who joined us today. Please go to stephenzunes.org. That's his website. He's also on Facebook. Find him on Facebook. He comments just about every day on Facebook. Follow him and like his posts. And thanks again to Nick Hernandez for helping us. We produce these webinars on a regular basis, the first Monday of the month. Thank you to my colleagues, particularly Aftab Siddiqui for his help, and Marjan and Imad who joined us today. We plan to continue to do this work through this year. This was a gift that came to us through that horrible pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, that we learned to use this technology to connect with people like we couldn't in the past. So that has been a gift of the suffering that we went through last year, and we plan to continue to do this. And I really hope that Dr. Zunes will join us again and talk to us again about these issues. And I would just love to I could spend hours listening to this gentleman with his fascinating knowledge and insights into critical and crucial. And please stay safe. We know there's all kinds of stuff going on in California. You've got wildfires everywhere, and bad weather and hot weather. And so please stay safe and join us again.
Very well.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Hadi.